Well, good to see you, Adam, and good to see or know that all the Literati book club people are listening in. I've been fortunate enough to read your book Originals twice, and this weekend went through it for a second time. And I don't actually read many books to do with advice for entrepreneurs or business people. I mean, in the past, I've just, my attitude's just been screw it, let's do it. But I have found your book exceptionally rewarding, and it's been my Christmas present to my senior team at Virgin this year. We were lucky enough, well, I was lucky enough anyway, to spend a lot of time on the Strive challenge, which and I just hope that you enjoyed it and you found it worthwhile. Do you want to just reminisce a bit about that?
Yeah, I would love to, Richard. First of all, huge honor that you chose Originals. I can't think of a more original person than you. And you've now read the book one more time than I have. So I feel like I should be interviewing you about this. But yeah, last year on Strive was one of the most extraordinary weeks of my life. I did not know when I signed up that I was going to be hiking for half a day and then biking up a 70-kilometer mountain and then trying to swim across a lake. And I don't think I've ever been so exhausted, but I just thought it was incredible to gather a group of people who were excited to push the limits of their own capabilities and support each other along the way. And I will tell you, my favorite moment from it was we were sitting in a hot tub. I don't know if you remember this, and you ran over and jumped and did a cannonball into
it. I was jealous, I suspect. I just wanted to empty all the water out.
Well, I thought it was a remarkably effective way for you to just eliminate the power distance in the group and say, look, I am not above making a fool of myself to make everyone else comfortable. Yeah,
no, I think, yeah, I'm a great believer that leaders should lead. And, if you're having a party, make sure that that you're the first in the pool fully clothed, and then everybody else will jump in and have a good time. And so yeah, so I agree. It's very important that good leaders have fun with everybody, with their whole team. I never knew that you were this word organizational psychologist. What on earth is an organizational psychologist?
Yeah, I definitely can't cure your OCD or straighten up your closet. Basically, my job as an organizational psychologist is to try to make work suck a little bit less. And so I spend a lot of my time trying to redesign jobs to make them more meaningful and motivating, help teams become more creative, cultures become more collaborative. Frankly, a lot of what you've done by experience and intuition, I like to gather data around and say, okay, can this work for more of the people in more of the companies?
Yeah, I was, yeah, one of the things that struck home in reading the book again this weekend was something that I hadn't really realized. I've always thought that entrepreneurs were pure risk takers, and that we'd take much bigger risks than your book has actually shown. And I mean, it was fascinating that people like Larry Page and Bill Gates, when they were starting their businesses, they made quite sure that they kept their foot in their studies, so that if the business didn't work out, they would have something to fall back on. Do you want to just expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, it was a surprise to me too, frankly, Richard, because I've always thought of entrepreneurs as like you, as daredevils, as being willing to just take the leap before they look. And the data just, really opened my eyes to the fact that a lot of entrepreneurs think about risk more like an investment portfolio, where if you're going to bet on a very risky stock, you should probably also have some of your money in some very boring, safe mutual funds. And I guess what was interesting to me about that is you can be daring and original in one part of your life and then be completely cautious and risk averse in another. And I was curious, are you an outlier on this? Are you a risk seeker in every domain of your life, or have you also balanced out that portfolio?
I sort of asked myself that again, having just finished reading that chapter, and I'm contrarian, I would say. In the early days of Virgin Records, I would slip a piece of paper in front of my wife and ask her to sign here, and hope that she didn't ask any questions. And I would be putting our home on the line in order for the business to survive. Not a sensible thing to do, but in the very early days, in those days, you couldn't, there weren't venture capitalists or people you could go to for money, so you just had to had to scrape to get anywhere. But I think I learned reasonably quickly that protecting the downside was critical, and so when we launched Virgin Atlantic, we had a very successful record company. The poor people at the record company were mortified that I wanted to start an airline, so I did a deal with Boeing whereby if I was wrong in thinking that people would like to fly on Virgin Atlantic, we could hand the 747 back at the end of the first 12 months. The 12 months went by. The airline was really successful, and we bought 2 more 747s, but at least we knew that if everything had gone wrong, we would be able to survive, and Virgin Records wouldn't be lost. So I think being bold, but also looking at ways to protect the downside is critical.
It's a bit like saying, screw it, let's do it. But if we do it, we've got to make sure we're not completely screwed if we fail.
Very true. Now, I'm going to look down occasionally because there's a lot of literati group that have asked me questions to ask you. This is a question from Tony. He said, chapter 7 discusses the ways to create a culture of original thinking and explains how being an original and innovative leader will not automatically create this culture in your company. And he wants to know, what leadership qualities do you think are effective in unleashing originality in others?
Well, I think this goes to the point about you jumping into the hot tub, right? I think the first thing that leaders who create cultures of originality do is they establish what's called psychological safety. Right? I think we all know the feeling of psychological safety. It's that sense that I can take a risk, I can try something new without being penalized. And I have to say, I watch a lot of leaders screw this up. And one of the ways that they mess it up that I talked about a little in the book is when they say, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. I think that's completely backward, because if people can only speak up when they have a solution, you will never hear about the biggest problems. So I've spent a lot of my time working with leaders trying to make it safe for them to say, look, I don't know what I'm talking about, or I don't know what I'm doing, or I don't have all the answers, because that's when people do start to raise the issues that need to be solved. And actually, one of my favorite ways to tackle this comes from Warby Parker, where I'm proud to say I've finally become a Warby Parker investor about a decade too late. But in the spirit of better late than never, of their 5 biggest innovations in the past decade, 4 of them have come out of what looks like a suggestion box, but it's actually a problem box. So anytime you see something that's broken in the company, it might be a technical bug, could be a management or leadership bug, you submit it into a Google Doc, and then they have senior managers vote every 2 weeks on which problems are important. So I get immediate feedback on my issue. And then if I want to solve one of those problems, I can build a team around me to do it, and I get some resources behind me. And I think for me, that's the first step for leaders, is just to say, let's surface all the problems, because then we can bring the canaries out of the coal mine, and we can figure out whether they have the knowledge and skills to actually do something about the issues we see.
You're talking about the glasses company that, I went on the website again as a result of your book this weekend, and it was great. Being able to put on any pair of glasses onto a real face and see it. I mean, it's brilliant, and no wonder they've done really well. And I do think that sometimes people think, oh my God, I should have invested, 10 years ago, I'd missed the boat. A brave person will often think, well, I missed the boat then, but let's do it now if we feel they've got a great future. On listening, an enormous believer that a good leader is a good listener, and that and also that a good leader is a good listener and also writes down the problems that people may be bringing them, or ideas that maybe people are bringing them, discussions and so on. And I think a lot of people leave companies because they're not listened to by their leaders, and they're frustrated, and they feel that they just feel they're not being listened to. I mean, would you like to expand on that a bit?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how many leaders don't take the time to hear complaints and problems and concerns and ideas and suggestions too. I think a lot of it is, leaders just feeling like they're too busy. But part of it is also being afraid that if people have a say and they don't get their way, then they're going to be demoralized and demotivated. Like I think a lot of the leaders that I've worked with will say, look, there's nothing worse than somebody listening to your idea and then completely ignoring it or dismissing it. And I think that's backward, right? People want to be heard even if they don't always get influence. It's a way of giving people a chance to express their values, right? To show that they matter. And so I think for me, leaders should be less afraid of listening to an idea that they don't run with. All they need to do is say, look, I'm hearing lots of people's problems and suggestions at this point. There's no way I'm going to implement them all, but I'm going to take them all seriously. And we're going to try to figure out if any of them are worth pursuing. And I think that people appreciate that opportunity to have a voice, right? Regardless of whether they ultimately get their way or not, which seems like a misconception that we ought to be debunking.
Yeah, it's yeah. I mean, I feel that to make an exceptional company, I think comes from not just the leader of the company, but the leaders of departments and so on. Getting out and about. I think the reason that Virgin Atlantic has survived 36, 37 years is, if I'm on a Virgin Atlantic plane, I'll have a notebook, I'll go around and talk to all the staff, I'll talk to the guests. At the end of the flight, I'll have 15, 16 different things, maybe half to do with ways of helping the staff, another half to do with ways of helping our customers. And I think a lot of them are tiny little things, but what makes an exceptional restaurant, an exceptional airline, or an exceptional any company is getting all those little details right. And somebody if somebody wants kosher, is not getting their kosher food properly on a plane, you've got to sort it. You've got to make sure you've got the best kosher food on a plane, and then you'll have thousands of people who eat kosher food come back and travel with you and so on. And it's mind-boggling to me that sometimes leaders just sit there, they don't take notes, they nod, and that nothing's gonna happen.
Well, I would say though, you've taken that a step further. So we've all heard about the value of management by walking around. I've seen you though take that and say, you know what, I'm not just going to manage by walking around, I'm going to manage by doing. I have a colleague, Sigal Barsaid, who's actually studied this and written about it. And she said, look, leaders ought to spend at least 10% of their time doing the actual work of the people that they supervise, right? If you're running a call center, you should field calls at least once a month. If you're running an airline, right, you should go and serve drinks, or you should go and sit in the cockpit and really experience the job as opposed to just watching it. And I think that's another display of leader humility that I don't think we have enough of, but it's got to be such a surprise and delight for your employees to see you walk onto the plane and not only ask what's going on, but actually say, hey, can I take your order today?
Yeah, no, it's good to do things like that, but it's actually I think essential in building a great business. Right, another couple of things. Let's see, a question from Booba, wonderful name. What are value tools or practices can help us measure our progress of becoming original? Difficult question.
Oh, that is a hard question. Why would you want to measure originality? Doesn't that just kill the spirit of creativity? I think the most original things in life are almost impossible to quantify. I think though, if you want to feel like you're making progress, that's entirely reasonable. And I would say, as probably some people will remember from chapter 2, the best path to quality is quantity, right? Generally speaking, the most original people have the most bad ideas because they just have the most ideas, right? And the more variety you can generate, the more likely you are to stumble onto something that might not seem like it's a great idea on its face, but ultimately is really promising. And so, you know, I don't know whether, you know, for most people that's increasing the number of ideas they generate every week by 10% or 100%, but I think it's definitely increasing your idea output. And, you know, Richard, you're such an interesting example of this, right? Because of all of the companies you've started, you can make an equally long list of the companies you've launched that didn't work out. And you seem to see that as just part of the creative process. Like you're not accumulating failures, you're accumulating experiences.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I mean, you know, I've very, very, very rarely gone into starting a company with the idea of making money, you know, per se. I mean, I've gone into it because I think we are creating something completely original, and if it's, you know, if it turns out to be exceptional, then hopefully the money will come in and you'll be able to pay the bills. You know, I think one of the best examples of that is, you know, in the last few months, we've gone through a torrid time, most of our companies, with COVID, as most people are listening to have been through a torrid time. You know, but the company that's come to our rescue is the one that most people thought, you know, we were completely and utterly dotty to get involved in, which was Virgin Galactic, our space company, that is just doing extraordinarily well. But you know, we never embarked on a space company or an airline with the idea of making lots of money. We embarked on them to make a difference and have some fun along the way. So it's interesting, in your book you talked about I think Edison having patented, you know, 1,200 or 1,150 different patents, and how of them all, maybe, you know, 2 or 3, you know, were worked out. And were there any other examples of people like that that you can think of?
I mean, I honestly could not find a field where that wasn't true, right? So yeah, I guess there are a few people who, you know, basically only gave one shot on goal and they ended up scoring. But most of the great inventors and creators and scientists and artists were people who accumulated just a huge volume of work. And so, you know, I think the examples that jumped out at me were, you know, Picasso with over 20,000 pieces of art. We could, you know, think about all the Shakespearean plays where, you know, for every Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet, there was a Timon of Athens, which, you know, not even real Shakespeare fans consider to be a particularly good piece of work. You know, I think we see it with musicians, right? There are lots of unmemorable Mozarts and Bachs and Beethovens, and even Einstein, right? Einstein, we know for his theories of relativity, but he published 250 papers, and most of those did not make a dent in physics. And so I think there's, you know, there's something to me inspiring about saying, look, if we only look at originals at their peak, they seem to be superhuman. But if we look at the entire body of work that they've created, we can see that they are in fact mere mortals. And that signals to the rest of us, we could become a little bit more like them.
Yeah, I had Larry Page has become a good friend who was one of the founders of Google, and he happens to live next to us in the British Virgin Islands, and he'll come over for a drink at the bar, and for about 45 minutes he will come up with idea after idea after idea, and if it was anybody but Larry, I most likely would have walked away after 2 or 3 of the most zany ideas ever. But you know that you've got, you know, there's most likely a gem of something in every idea he has. He doesn't go in and do them all, but he does a fair number of them. And like with all of us, he falls on his face sometimes, and is supremely successful at other times. Okay, I've got one here from Met Studio. How long ago did you come up with the idea to write originals, and who was your target audience in mind when you wrote originals, or did you have one?
Oh, it's a hard question to answer, because Richard, as I'm sure you've experienced through a lot of your life, there isn't a flash of a moment where you say, okay, now I know that I have my idea, right? It's been brewing and building in the back of my mind for years, usually before I decide to sit down and write it. I think that probably in some ways the earliest seeds were planted when I was a high school senior. So I grew up in Michigan. I was planning to go to the University of Michigan for college, like most of my friends were going to do. And I woke up one morning having had a dream that I went to Harvard. And I thought, you know what, I'll just send in an application, and it probably won't work out, but it's worth a shot. And then I got in, and I decided that I was going to go. But I was nervous that I wouldn't have any friends there. I was going to go halfway across the country, and I literally didn't know anyone. So I went to the state-of-the-art technology at the time, which was America Online. And I started searching profiles to see if I could find future classmates. And I found a few people, and we started a little email list. And pretty soon we were building an online social network. And by the time we arrived on campus as freshmen, we had connected more than 1/8 of the Harvard entering classes. And then we shut down our online social network because we're all in Cambridge now. We don't need to be connected online, right? We're living within just walking distance of each other. And then 5 years later, Mark Zuckerberg starts Facebook in the house next door to me. And so if you think about, my friends and I, right, we could look at that and say we have a lot of regrets because, we built an earlier version of a social network that could have taken off. And, it really never occurred to me to turn that into a company, right? I thought that connecting online was something you do from a distance, not in the same room or in the same town. I thought of myself as a college student, not an entrepreneur. And I really didn't think I had the knowledge or the expertise to do it. I don't even know how to code, right? And I think that experience really left me wondering, okay, when people have ideas that turn out to be really promising, why don't they pursue it, right? Why do we censor ourselves? Why do we silence ourselves? Why do we hold ourselves back in pursuing our most original ideas? And that was probably the beginning of wanting to write it. And I wanted to write it for people like me who, occasionally would have an interesting idea, but would say, you know what, I'm not creative. I'm not a risk taker. This is not something I could ever pursue.
As somebody that comes from the music business, if I look back at many artists, they would have a spectacular hit. Like Mike Oldfield's Tubular the Bells, for instance, many years ago. And then they would struggle to do a follow-on. Are you going to be able to do a follow-on to this wonderful book?
I hope so. This will come out in February. So.
It looks, think again. Okay, and then do you mind? Are you allowed to talk about it? What is the difference between that and originals?
Well, I think for Literati and for you, I could probably get away with it. So, think again.
By the way, Literati people, this is an exclusive on a new book. Nobody's ever done an interview here with this man before on this book, and here we are.
Well, it's hard to say no to Sir Richard. So here we are. Think again in some ways is something that I should have thought to start writing during this pandemic. And the idea actually came to me a couple of years earlier when I was struck that people who were good at thinking were not necessarily good at rethinking. That the very people who I thought of as smart or brilliant or intelligent were the people I had the hardest time getting to change their minds and admit that they were wrong. And I felt like there was a real need to teach people that, that questioning our own assumptions and even letting go of some beliefs that we held that no longer make sense is a skill. That, sometimes consistency is a virtue, but in most situations, flexibility is more of a virtue. And so I sat down to write this book about how we could rethink our own opinions, how we could open other people's minds, how we could build organizations and institutions and schools where people are really lifelong learners. And then this pandemic hit, and all of a sudden rethinking is in every single headline, right? We have to rethink, just basic fundamental assumptions like, do we need an office? How do we communicate? How do we learn? What's safe to do outside of, of our own homes? And so in some ways, I think that rethinking has been forced on us this year. And a lot of us have realized that we're not that good at it. And so I wanted to really take the best science I could find as a psychologist and say, this is something I've spent most of my career trying to do, right? I've tried to rethink what it takes to be original or what it takes to be generous. And now what I want to do is actually explore rethinking itself as a skill and try to explain how we can all get better at it. So that's a little preview.
Yeah, no, it's I'm looking forward to reading it. Yeah, when I start a new company, I'll leave my houseboat or house or wherever it is I'm living at the time, and go and spend 2 months trying to learn everything there is about a new industry, and yeah, go from department to department till I feel I've learned everything. But then I'll retreat back to my my home, and from pretty well since I was a teenager, I've worked from home. And I think, as a lot of people have discovered in the last few months, that working from home, you've got more time to think. You've got more time to look after yourself, keep healthy, keep fit. You've got more time for your family. But actually, you get a hell of a lot more work done. And you could achieve a hell of a lot more. I mean, in the last 8 months, I've been at my home trying to firefight on issues around the world, and encourage our teams and so on. Haven't been able to travel much in those months, and I think it's been incredibly productive. So I'm most Virgin companies, I think, are going this way, but people want to work from home. That they should be able to work from home. If they want to work from home on Fridays and Mondays, they should be able to work from home. It's nice to have a building where people can come and socialize and meet and talk about things, and just get out of their home occasionally. But I think there's a lot to be said for working from home, and I sort of got a feeling that might be one area that you've really pushed in your new book.
Well, what's particularly amazing to me about that is the number of people who were resistant to rethinking where we work before we got forced into this virtual situation, right? So I think it was the beginning of 2018, and I went to 10 of the most powerful Silicon Valley CEOs. And I said, hey, I'd love to run an experiment on work from home Fridays, just testing the effects on productivity and creativity of just giving people 1 day a week where they can work wherever they want. And none of the CEOs were willing to try it. And I grilled them on why, and they said, well, it's a little bit like opening Pandora's box. And once we let people out of the office, they'll never come back. Our collaboration and our creative collisions and our culture are all going to fall apart. And what's hilarious to me is at least 3 of those CEOs have now announced they might never go back to an office. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if they'd been a little more open to rethinking those assumptions earlier, could they have been ahead of this curve, right? Could they have been actually planning for it proactively as opposed to reacting and firefighting, as you've said?
Yeah. Well, at least they've seen the light anyways. Right, a couple more of the literati questions. You use a lot of great examples in your book of people who have gone against the grain. Have you got a favorite example, and why does that favorite example resonate with you?
Oh, there's so many good examples. It's a little bit like being asked, who's your favorite child? Right? I love them all. I think one of the ones that probably has taught me the most in retrospect is Carmen Medina. I think as an early stage CIA agent who realized that they needed to adopt the internet long before the intelligence community really appreciated that. I think what was interesting to me about Carmen's story is that I thought for a long time that if you have original ideas, or if you think an organization is doing something that's backward, that what you ought to do is immediately come in guns blazing and try to change it. And I think what her story reminded me of is the value of a combination of patience and perseverance, right? To say, okay, it might actually be in some situations that it's better to work your way up the hierarchy before you try to reinvent the system, or that it's better to earn your stripes and prove your credibility before you go and challenge people and try to really force them to upend the way that they're used to working and communicating. And so I guess it's a reminder to me that when somebody says no to an idea, that doesn't mean the idea is over, right? It just means you need to find a back door or another way in. And I find that pretty encouraging.
Yeah, no, I'm an optimist, and if somebody asked me a question like, what was the worst thing that happened in your life? I can't think of anything because I've put it behind me. I'm looking forward in a really optimistic way. I mean, do you think being an optimist plays an important role in people's lives? I mean, how do the difference between, say, an optimist and a pessimist?
I think it has to, especially now, right? I think we know, I have a colleague, Marty Seligman, who's a psychologist who spent a lot of his career studying optimism and pessimism. And Marty's found that when things go wrong, what pessimists tend to do is they personalize them and say, this is all my fault. They see them as pervasive. They think every part of my life is worse because of this. And they see them as permanent. Things are never going to get better. And I've watched a lot of people do that during this pandemic, right? Saying, okay, especially with the permanence part, this feels like it's going to be endless, and it's making every domain of my life worse. And what an optimist will often do in that situation is to say, look, this is not my fault, definitely, right? This is making a lot of parts of my life worse or harder, but there are also silver linings, right? I enjoy the fact that I don't have to get dressed for work every day, or at least I don't have to change my pajama bottoms. I love the fact that I don't have to do my hair, although, you know what, some of us have never had to do our hair, so that didn't benefit all of us, but they'll find the silver linings there pretty quickly. And I think the most interesting conversation that I've had in the last 8 months or so about how to cope with what seems like a very pessimistic situation came from Scott Kelly, the astronaut who spent a year in space. And I called Scott for an episode of my Work Life podcast right after the pandemic started, because I thought if anybody understands how to live through an extended period of remote work, it's the guy who spent a year off the planet Earth. And of all the things that Scott said to me, the one that's really stuck with me is he said, look, I had my mission from NASA, but when I went for the year in space, I also had goals for how I wanted to feel. And I was a little caught off guard by this, because Scott was a Navy test pilot, right? He's great, gruff and tough and disagreeable, not the kind of guy who normally talks about emotions, but he set a goal that he wanted to come back to Earth with the same energy and enthusiasm that he had when he left. And as a psychologist, I thought that was ingenious, because one, when you set a goal for how you want to feel when you return, it immediately gives you a positive image of the future, something to look forward to. Two, it speeds up time, right? That idea of mental time travel, of fast forwarding, makes the days in between feel like they're passing a little more quickly. And then three, you can rewind and say, okay, in order to land at that place of hope or energy or enthusiasm, what do my daily routines need to be to get there? And so I took that and immediately sat down with my wife and kids and said, all right, let's imagine it's the first month that the pandemic is over. Where do we want to go? Who do we want to see? What do we want to do? And it immediately gave us something exciting to look forward to. And I think that's a conversation that leaders ought to have with their teams, but it's probably a discussion we could all have with our families too, if we haven't already. And that is fundamentally what an optimist would do.
Yeah. I mean, Scott Kelly has a wonderful brother called Mark Kelly, who I suspect you've met as well. And Mark has just been elected to the Senate, which is, I think, fantastic. Obviously, his wife was shot as a senator in a car park, and I don't think it's using too strong a word, was crippled for life as a result. And his mission is going to be to try to get some sense into the gun laws in America. What advice would you give him?
That's such a hard question. I think the place I would start is to say that there's a lot of polarization in the world right now. And I spent a whole chapter actually, Think Again, trying to explain how to have charged conversations. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make is we speak in the language of our own values as opposed to shared or common values. So if you think about, liberals and conservatives, or in the US, it would be, Democrats and Republicans. Generally speaking, when Democrats try to influence Republicans, they speak with mostly liberal language. They talk about themes like justice when it comes to anti-racism or equality. When it comes to talking about climate change, they'll talk about trying to promote health and safety. And I think that those are reasonable values to appeal to. But what they're not doing is looking to the other side and saying, what are the values that might matter to conservatives? And there's some work by John Haidt and his colleagues, which shows that on the conservative side, you are much more likely to care about equality of opportunity than equality of outcomes. You are much more likely to care about preserving the purity of our planet, or even, you know, something as basic as defending freedom, right? Than you are to say, okay, I value the environment for environment's sake. And so I think there's a simple shift in language that could probably help with bridging some of these divides. I don't think it's going to solve all of our problems, but to say, hey, you know what? We inherited an incredibly beautiful, pristine Earth, and we have a responsibility to preserve that. Or to say, you know, hey, we want to stand against racism because everyone deserves an opportunity and everyone deserves freedom. I think that's speaking in the language of common values as opposed to divided values.
I think your next book should be not just one chapter, but a whole book on how these two divided parts can come together. I mean, I find that if I think I'm more liberal bent personally, but if I sit down with a staunch, person, more of a sort of Republican if I was American, and then we go through issue by issue, gun control, females' rights, all the big issues, drug reform, etc. What's fascinating is that that 90% we actually agree on. The divide is really not that big. It's how it's presented, as you say. And if you've got time, if you could knock out a book and try to bridge the divide, that would be great next time round.
Adding it to my list. Stay tuned.
Okay, another one from have you got time for a couple more? Another one from our Literati reader questions, and this is from an easy to say name, Patrick. After you finished writing this book, what is the biggest change you made to your day-to-day life? What did you actually learn yourself from writing this book?
I think the biggest change I made day to day was actually a pretty simple one. And it was inspired by that evidence that if you think about your own circadian rhythm, you're actually most creative at the times when you're least alert. So I had always thought as a morning person that I should try to generate ideas in the morning because that's when I'm awake. And then I realized, but that's also when I'm most linear and most structured and most likely to get stuck inside a box. And so now what I like to do is after our kids go to bed, I like to spend about half an hour brainstorming. And I wake up in the morning then with a whole list of ideas to work with, and some of them are horrendous, and I'm embarrassed that I thought of it. In other cases, I feel like I have some good material to work with my fresher, more analytical mind. And so I think really dividing the task of generating ideas into a separate window from the time when I actually evaluate ideas, so that I can be open and creative and curious at night, and then put on my more discerning hat in the morning. That's made a big difference. And I have also become a little more comfortable procrastinating. I still like to be the person who finishes important projects, 3 or 4 months ahead of a deadline. But I've started to recognize, after doing the research and after looking at examples like Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Lincoln and Da Vinci, recognizing that there is real value in waiting for an idea to come. And sometimes when I procrastinate, it's not because I'm lazy or because I don't care. It's because the problem I'm working on is hard and I haven't figured it out yet, and I need to put it off until I do sort of incubate enough to figure out what the solution might be.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to give you one more from Molly. What is the impact of social media on originality, in your opinion, or on non-conformity?
I think it can go both ways. I think, on the one hand, social media has given us access to a much wider variety of people and, thought processes and ways of thinking than we had access to before. On the other hand, of course, a lot of us are trapping ourselves in filter bubbles or in echo chambers where we only hear from people who think similarly to us. So I think social media is like most technologies, right? It's not inherently good or bad. It's fundamentally a question of how you use it. And I think if you use it to follow people who have conclusions that you don't necessarily agree with, but you respect their thought processes, if you use it to be surrounded by people who make you think hard, as opposed to people who make you nod and smile all the time, then I think it's a great source of original thinking. And Richard, I have to ask you, I caught something on social media a couple weeks ago. I saw a former student of mine, Sarah Lukian, on the very first Hyperloop ride, cheering. And it was such an exciting thing to watch. And I'd love to hear a little bit about, I know when I first saw Elon's drawing of the Hyperloop, I thought he was insane. How did you decide you wanted to do that? And what's the journey been like?
Well, I have a person called Will Whitehorn who worked for Virgin and is now gone off on his own, as a lot of people do who work for Virgin. His grandfather actually patented the idea of Hyperloop back in the 1930s, 1930s, I think it was. The patent, lay dormant until Will showed it to me a while back, and then sort of Elon also brought up the subject, and we lost a wonderful employee from Virgin Galactic, and I asked why he'd left, and I was told he'd gone to try to set up something called Hyperloop, and I got in touch with him, and he's an absolute genius engineer, and we decided, to invest in it and help him get it going, and he's built a fantastic test track outside Las Vegas in the desert, and yeah, it was a fabulous moment when the first Hyperloop went with the two of them on it, and it's a long-term project, a bit like Virgin Galactic. I mean, we're not actually going to, see Hyperloops going from city to city before 2026. But one day, I think it will make, a very, very big difference. And, it's an exciting project to be involved with. If I may, I'll just end on, we've got a tough current climate. We're dealing with a global pandemic. We're dealing with quite a lot of economic uncertainty. We're dealing with immense political upheaval. Obviously, climate change rearing its ugly head. What advice would you give to people who are facing problems that they really never expected to face?
I think the place I'd probably start on that is to say that I read some evidence recently that during the pandemic, we're in touch with our strongest ties about 40% more often than we were before. So our families, our friends, our closest colleagues, we know we have to stay in regular contact. We're losing touch with our weak ties. Our more distant colleagues, our acquaintances, people we would run into occasionally, we're in touch with them about 10% less often than we were before. And I think that's a mistake, because the data show we actually get more creative ideas from our weak ties than our strong ties, right? The strongest ties are the people who tend to know the same people and the same things that you do. So they give you a lot of redundant knowledge, whereas weak ties travel in different circles, they learn different things, and they can open up real access to new ideas and perspectives you haven't seen before. And so I think reaching out to weak ties is one thing I would encourage people to do. I've got some colleagues that actually created an app that they brought me in as a co-founder on. It's called Givitas. And the idea is that you bring a group of people together who don't necessarily know each other well, or even a community or a whole company, and you invite everyone to make a request for something they want or need, but can't get on their own. And then you have people use their knowledge and networks to try to fulfill the request. And you see all these strange requests. You get people who want to see a Bengal tiger in the wild. We've had people looking for jobs at companies you've never heard of. But most of the people who are able to get help, which is the majority of the people, get it from their weak ties, not their strong ties. And it's not just because you have more weak ties. It's also because those weak ties are able to open doors that you didn't know existed. And I think that's something we could all do a little more often. There's a particular kind of weak tie that I think is especially valuable for most of us. It's called a dormant tie. So Richard, your dormant ties are the people that you used to know but lost touch with in the last 3, 5, 10 years. And the data show that if you're working on a problem right now, if you reconnect with someone you used to know, you will get better ideas than if you reach out to someone that you currently know. And so there's a colleague of mine, Daniel Levin, who studies this. What he likes to do is he'll send executives and employees out to reconnect with a dormant tie. And they always groan and they say, well, some ties are dormant for a reason, but actually most ties are not dormant for a reason. We didn't mean to fall out of touch. We got busy, we moved, we changed jobs. And over 90% of people find reconnecting not only to be a creative experience, but also an energizing experience. And so I would say now is not just the time to connect, it's the time to reconnect.
I've used the last 6 months to ring up people that I maybe haven't talked to for 20 years. And after a few minutes with one of those conversations, the guy turned around to me and said, Richard, are you dying? He was convinced that the only reason I rang him up was because I was ringing up all my friends because I was going out. But anyway, it's great advice, and as is everything you said on this. And I've had the privilege of walking with you through the mountains and climbing mountains together, and tapping into your amazing brain. And it's great to be able to share it with all the Literati people. And thank you so much for your time, Adam, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Pleasure was all mine. Look forward to striving together again soon for big change.
Great. Cheers. Nice to see you.